But
Seems to me it's
it's quite okay. You just go to the islands and everything's kosher.
Especially if you're Rod Stewart or Rod
Yep.
Phillip or whatever the guy's name is,
Yeah.
the minister of finance. Okay, so let's start again. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Ein shoyrin es hamursan l'tarna goyim. Mursan is like bran, and you're not supposed to soak it to serve to chickens, because if you soak it in water, of course, we're afraid it will become chametz. Avol cholton, but you're allowed to plunge it, Rashi says, into roischin, into boiling hot water, because when you plunge it into boiling hot water, it doesn't let it get chametz, yet it will soften it up. Good morning, Bensi. Ha'isha, a woman, loisishra es hamursan, shetoilech b'yada lemerchatz. Women used to use soap. I guess men didn't bother using soap in those days, but women used to use soap. The way they made this soap was they took the psoilus of wheat and they softened it up, and that's what they would scrub themselves with. So she's not allowed to soak that to take it with her to America, so it should soften it up. Aval shafahi b'psar yavish, but when it's dry, she could rub it on her skin, even though her skin has some moisture on it. Rashi says we're not worried. We're not worried that it will become chametz. Lo yilos adam chitin v'yinich hamakosai. You shouldn't chew wheat kernels and use that as a salve on his makkah, because it will become chametzik. Zok the Heilige Mishnah, Tanu Rabbanon, Elu devarim she'ein boin l'dei chametz. The following list are things that cannot become chametz. Ha'afui, once it's baked already. And like we discussed earlier, the problem with gebrokst is not because we're afraid after it was baked, if you make it wet, it could become chametz. Rather, we're concerned that there's small particles of flour that were never mixed into the dough. And therefore, those, even though they're baked, if you take raw flour and bake it, that flour will still be able to become chametzik if mixed with water. V'amavushel, and if it's cooked, v'cholot, and if it's plunged into hot water. So let's analyze what's the difference between mavushel and cholot. So I would argue that cholot means you boil the water up and then you plunge the dough into boiling hot water. Mavushel is you take cold water, you put wheat into it, flour into it, and you put it on the stove, and then it'll cook up. Which means as the water is heating up, there's plenty of time for the wheat to become chametz. So if a mavushel v'cholot shechol to broishchen. If it's cooked, as it's heating up, it'll become chametzik. What it means is when it says v'amavushel, it means even if you cook something that had already been baked, that cooking will not allow it or will not make it become chametz. Once it's baked already, it can no longer become chametz. Tanya Rabbi Yosy bar Yehuda Amar. What if you have a barrel that's catching the water running out of your eaves, or the water that's dripping down from your eave that's leaking, so it's drip, and you have a barrel underneath it, and you put some wheat into that barrel. So it's getting wet, but it's constantly getting battered by the next drop that's hitting it at 32 feet per second, which is the acceleration rate of gravity. Even if it's being dripped upon all day long, this dough or this flour will not become chametzik. That means if it's dripping one after the other, if it's dripping every 5 minutes, then there's time in between the impact of the next drip to become chametz. But if it's one after the other, then we don't have a problem. Rashi says anybody the fact that it's constantly dripping is not allowing the bread to become chametz. And we know if you pound the dough, it doesn't become chametz. Don't try this at home. Amar Reb Shila, Vesika Shori. The Michael called Vesika is mutter. Rashi says it's a Michael Kemach. It's something that's made with flour. How could you say it's mutter vatanya Vesika aser? So Gemara like Asha, hada avdi b'mishchol milcha, hada avdi b'mayav milcha. Sometimes this Vesika, it was flour mixed with oil and salt. oil is meperis, and we said meperis are not machmitz. Therefore, if the vesika was made with only oil and no water, then it will be mutter on Pesach. But if you used water in the mixture of the vesika, then it's going to become chametz and it'll be aser. Omar Zutra, lalimchi inish keder b'kimcha. People often use flour to thicken up a soup, a very watery soup. You could use flour to thicken it up. So you shouldn't use flour to thicken up a soup on Pesach. Rashi doesn't necessarily like to soup. Rashi is from tafshil. So it's any dish you put flour in to thicken it up. So you shouldn't do that. Even bekimcha the avishna. Even kimcha da vishna. What is kimcha da vishna? So Rashi tells us, "Vafilu bekimcha da vishna, shenischayva, shenisyashva, shenisyavsha." It's already dried out. So kimcha da vishna is wheat kernels that you've placed in the oven to dry them out really well. V'niklis betaner, and they're somewhat singed, roasted in the oven. Kishilecha when they're moist. Oishan oisha kali betaner, it makes it roasted. Varei kafuya, which means that the kernel, even before it came in contact to any water, it was considered fully baked. Nevertheless, you shouldn't put flour that you made out of these kernels that were already baked, that you ground up into flour. You shouldn't put that into the kedera. Why? Dilma lebashal shapir. Maybe when you roasted in the oven, Rashi says, it didn't get quite roasted enough. Rashi says, "Lenasas koli kol tzarcha betaner," and therefore umachmetzes betavshel. When you make it into flour and you put it into the tavshel, it will become chametz then. When you mix it into the dish that you put it into to thicken up, machmetzes. So Rashi Pavorans, we said chalut will not become chametz. If you plunge something into boiling hot water, it won't become chametz. The teretz is when you mix the flour into this tavshel, the tavshel is often not hot enough to accomplish chalut, and therefore the flour will make the dish chametz. Yes.
Is this a question of gebrux or not gebrux, or this is a different level?
This is a different level. Gebrux is after we know something has already been fully baked, and we learned earlier in the Mishnah that once in the Brisa, once something is fully baked, even if you cook it afterwards, there's no chashash of chametz whatsoever. The reason why we're concerned with gebrux is because we're afraid, even though they made a dough to make the matzah, maybe there were some individual flour specks that wasn't incorporated in the dough, loose flour. Sometimes when your mother rolls out her kokosh cake, she puts flour there so that it shouldn't stick to the counter. So there could be some excess flour, and we're afraid that excess flour got baked in the matzah, and that excess flour that's in the matzah will become wet if you brok, and that'll become chametz. You know what's your hand?
Do you know how old the minhag of gebrux is? Like the Tanum? When did this?
No. The gebrux is from the Rishonim.
From the Rishonim?
Or maybe even the Achronim. Yeah, gebrux is not a minhag kadmon.
How come? Like, how did they all of a sudden have this new Zahiris?
Well, even the minhag to make matzah into a cracker, that's also a minhag from the Rishonim. It used to be matzah was like pita. It was geschmack. It was like halafa. But then they made it crunchy. I guess they got worried as it was neskat nodoros that it would be difficult to maintain it, so they got stricter. You're bringing up a point. If the Gemara didn't see a need to make gzeris, where do you find that Rishonim are making new gzeris? I think that's what you're touching on. So I once heard over from the Chassam Sofer, why is it by Pesach every year people come up with noch chumash? Was is schlecht saying, mein Tata hat so gefiert, and he allowed us to do ABC, so we can do ABC. You know, every day they come up with new chumash. You shouldn't drink the water, and you have to do the water before. There's chumash, we're always dreaming up with new chumash by Pesach. So I think I saw once from the Chassam Sofer a very interesting point. And he says that the geula that we had in the Mitzrayim was not a complete geula. When we left Mitzrayim, we still had very much the mentality of a slave, and it slowly evolved. Then it came to Matan Torah, and we were able to become our own nation. But the avdus that was imprinted into our DNA, so to speak, at our conception when Klal Yisrael was built in the crucible of Mitzrayim, is still inside us. And every year, Pesach time, we climb another level out of the gullus. So he says, therefore, it's very passendik that we should add chumrah upon chumrah, because every year there's another level of geula that we're experiencing, and because of that, it's appropriate that we should celebrate it with another chumrah of Pesach.
Sefer ate gebrocks. Didn't he eat
That's there,
gebrocks?
yours, David. Don't worry.
What? Didn't the Sefer eat gebrocks?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh.
You're not muted, but I still can't hear you. I'm not sure why. But
I
whatever
hear
you're saying
him.
sounds
I
very
hear
good.
him. He's saying
You
this.
hear?
Last night that the less we know, the more chumras we need.
Yeah, but can anyone else hear me?
I hear you.
Can you hear
David, I
David?
hear you. David,
I don't hear Becky either.
Okay,
hear
so
anybody.
Marie,
Maybe
tell
it's my-
him that the Chassam Sefer
I might have a
ate
problem. Let me
gebrocks.
see why I can't hear.
Yes, you hear me? No?
Is this work? Well, I'm here. See if this works. It should be working. 1 second. It seems like everybody can hear each other. I just can't hear. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
You could hear
you.
me? Then
Yes.
I can't hear you. Okay, so let me
That-
see if I can fix that.
that's the way he likes it, I
Let me
think.
see if I can fix that. Speaker. I have to speak the right speaker. I'm
You
picking
heard me a
it.
minute ago. I don't understand. You
Why
heard
is
me
it
like a
not
minute
working?
ago.
He was very quiet before me.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure why I don't hear it. I'm going to turn it on. Turn it on again. Okay, now I'm going to turn it on again.
You hear now? You hear now? Yes, you hear now?
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I heard you before.
Yeah.
You don't hear us.
You hear me, but I can't hear you.
Right. I think Mechi hears me.
Okay.
I hear
Okay.
you, David.
Now
I
I
hear
can-
you. Yeah, you hear?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay,
You
now
hear
I can
us?
hear again.
okay. So
I
my
hear
point,
you. I hear you.
all right. So the point I was making was that you just said, you made a whole speech that the Chassam Sefer, he justifies the Chumras, but he himself ate gebrocks. Right. You hear that?
No, you
Because he was a
justified the chumrah
Yaki.
for you.
Yeah, right.
No, for Karen, he was trying to say, even though I don't hold of it, I respect you doing it. You can be
Lahavdil like a politician.
Yeah, right.
You don't have to go to St. Lucia for vacation. Chas v'sholom, I don't object. I'm going to go. Just don't catch me. Okay. Zog the hele gemar weiter. So Amar Yosef, loy lichloit inish trey chiti b'hadei adodi. You shouldn't take two individual kernels of wheat and plunge them into hot water together. Rashi says if you want to do that, you should do it one kernel at a time. It's going to slow down your process a little bit. Dilma ozla chada v'yosva b'tziraya dechavra. There's a little groove in a wheat kernel, and if one wheat kernel sort of gets lodged into that little crevice, and therefore v'losolak lahu dikula demaya me'abaruchsa, and therefore the water, the hot water that you splash over the wheat kernels won't reach every square millimeter of surface area of the chita. We're afraid the asal de chimut, and that's where it will become chametzik. V'amar Abaye, lelichrich inish trei shibulei b'hadei adodi. You shouldn't even take two stalks of wheat and singe them directly in fire. You're not even having any water there present at all. Even directly to singe them in fire, you shouldn't do. You know why? Because when you put the kernels into fire, they excrete some moisture. And we're afraid some moisture will leave one stalk and it will drip into another stalk, and it will cause chametz. Now, if you think about it, this liquid that comes out of the wheat is mei peretz. And we know there's a shaila if mei peretz could make something chametz. And that's what the Gemara is going to jump into. Amalei Rava, no, we're afraid there won't be immediately birth. We're afraid.
That's what he says.
That's what who says?
What did Abaya tell
You
us?
shouldn't singe two stalks of wheat together. Put them in the fire to roast.
Right.
Because we're afraid moisture will come out of one and drip into another.
Right. So immediately it's burned. That's the way you make matzah. You put water in it, then you put it into a fire.
That's dough, thin dough into a fire. But clumps of grain might be a little different. Clumps of grain might be a little different. So so why two stalks? Even one stalk has multiple little kernels of grain on it. There's no problem at all because may perish ninu. Any juice that's coming directly out of the wheat kernel is may perish. May perish and may perish will not make chametz. So therefore, you're allowed to singe as many wheat kernels as you'd like together, as long as there's no water present. And not only that, Abaye also allows you to singe wheat kernels together, but not because he holds may perish is not machmitz, because of a different reason. The chol agav midlayu loy machmitzi. The halacha is, and I don't know if this is relevant, but it's similar, and that is when we salt our meat, there's a rack that has holes in it that would allow anything to drain off of it, and then they pile the meat pieces stacked one on top of the other. Well, they salt on each piece individually, but they stack them up on top of each other. Well, the problem is, as the dam comes out of the upper piece of meat and is running down, it's running over the lower meats. So the halacha is, as long as it could drain out the bottom, it's not sitting in the container. We say that each of the meat, since it's busy being piled its dam, it's not going to absorb dam. As long as it's not sitting in it, it's just draining over it. So Abai is saying something similar. Since there's no bottom, you're holding it in a fire, any liquid that comes out, even if it drips on another kernel, but it's on its way down, and we'll say that it's not going to be machmitz, it will not be absorbed into a lower kernel as it's dripping down. So Amar Abai said, Haychavta da avishna, shchifa shari. If you have a container that you're drying out wheat kernels in, if you hold the container upside down, meaning there's a hole at the bottom, and as any moisture that comes out of the wheat kernels drips down and out of the inverted keli, then it would be mutter, because it will not be absorbed back on its way out into another kernel. But zakiva, if you have it right side up, osir, because at the bottom of the keli there'll be a pool of this juice that will be reabsorbed into one of the kernels, and that's going to make it chametz. Rava Amar afilos kifanami shari. Rava holds that the chalal may perish, don't make chametz. So even if you're capturing the juice at the bottom, and all the kernels would be sitting in that juice, and they'll absorb that juice, it's not a concern, because may perish ninu, who may perish eina machmitz. Taner Rabbanan. Ein loisasin sa'arin b'Pesach. What they used to do is, before they would grind anything into flour, they would first soak the kernels in water, which made the skin come off easily, which would allow for a much cleaner, whiter flour. So you shouldn't soak barley in water on Pesach. The imlosas, and if you did, and now you've placed your barley into a risk zone of becoming chametz, nisbaku, if they split asuris, they're going to be usher. Why they're going to be usher is actually the subject of a machlokes rishonim. So let's see what Rashi says. Nisbaku machmas hani puach, shemachmas hamayim. They've absorbed water, so they swell. They're going to be usher. The vadei memaharois lahachmitz. That's a sign that they're about to become chametz. There are those rishonim who learn that nisbaku is a sign that they already became chametz. The Rashi says that it's memaharois lahachmitz. Nisbaku asuris loy nisbaku mutaris. But if they haven't yet split, they're going to be mutter.
If it didn't yet become chametz, or if it already became chametz, they shouldn't say it's aser. They should say it's chametz.
I hear. That's a good point. Look at what Rabbi Yosy argues. Rabbi Yosy says, well, it's a question if he's arguing or if he's discussing a remedy. Shoyron b'chametz, right? If you see so Rashi says over here, if you see that they're blowing up, but they have not yet split, then shoyrin b'chametz tzimtzum. The chametz, the vinegar will instantly stop the fermentation process. It's ash shirayne balaz ve'ein menichon lahachmetz. It doesn't allow it to become chametz. Right? Mechabu mahadik. it pulls it together. It stops the fermentation process. So before it splits, Dr. Yosy, if you see it swelling, you can rectify the problem by putting it into vinegar very quickly. Amar Shmuel ein halacha Rabbi Yosy. So we need to remember this, Rabbi Yosy, because Rabbi Yosy is going to be quoted later on. So Rabbi Yosy holds that chaimetz, vinegar, stops the fermentation process, and Shmuel holds that it doesn't. Amar b'chista Amar ma'ukva. Lo nisbaku mamish. It doesn't mean that a mamish split, and that's when it becomes chametz. Rather, lechumra, it becomes chametz even earlier. Elakol she'ilu manichin al pi chavetz. If you put them on top of a barrel, and the aroma of the wine coming out of the barrel, and that would cause it to split. Rashi says it's so blown up. The reich will make them split. That's considered chametz already, even if it was not yet split. Shmuel's Mekel, he said nispaku mamish. Dafke, if it's split already, is it chametz? If it didn't split, it's not. So, Kresh, the Eina Suras El Nisbaku Mamish. But Oisan Loimu Vakois Mamish, Hayu Vitiran. So that's a little bit weiter in the Gemara. Avat Shmuel Uvda, Bedura Deve Bar Choshu. Shmuel Paskin Lakula, like his approach, like his opinion, in the city of Bar Choshu. And the case was Nisbaku Mamish. That's what Rashi is going on. They were already Nisbaku. Rashi says, Kloimar, Deina Suras El Nisbaku Mamish. So they were not nispaku mamish. He paskin that they only become chometz if it was nispaku mamish, and the chitin that he found in the dur devei rachoshu was v'oisen loy mevukos mamish hayu. They weren't split, and since he holds that they're not chometz until they're mamish split, he was matter them. Amar Rabba bal nefesh, yorei shemayim chosid. Rashi says loy yiltos. He shouldn't soak grain in water before he grinds it. Fragt the Gemara, my area bal nefesh. This is not a plachomer tamidis chassidus. This is a pashat to halacha. To Tanya, we learned earlier in the Brisa right up here, ein loises in sarin b'Pesach. So why would Rabbi say it's only for a bal nefesh if the Brisa says it? It's mandatory. Zakmar hachikamer bal nefesh afilu chitin. The Brisa was talking about sa'irin, but Rabbi is saying a bal nefesh should be machmer even by chitin. Why is that? The shariri. Chitin are a little bit harder, and they don't become chometz as easily. Rashi touches sharir are koshem; they're hard. Since they're hard, they might not become chometz as easily. Therefore, ikra adin, you'd be allowed to soak them in water, but abal nefesh shouldn't. Lo yaltos. Amalei Rab Nachman. So Rab Nachman said, "Man detzayis leila Abba. If you're going to listen to the chumras of Rabbah, that you can't even soak the wheat kernel before you grind them, meaning you're not going to be able to get the skin and the psoilos out. Ochel namade pusha. You're going to eat rotten bread, but it means it's dirty bread that has the psoilos mixed into it because you didn't do the lisa, you didn't soak it to get rid of the shell. So you're going to end up eating ichi bread. In other words, what he's trying to say is it's an excessive chumrah that maybe you shouldn't stick to, because the Habei Rav Huna lasasi in the home of Rav Huna they did it. Ubei Rabba Bar Amin lasasi. So they all did it. So Rabba's suggestion that you shouldn't do it is in fact a very big chumrah.
Isn't that whole wheat?
Whole wheat is when you don't take it out. Yeah, it's in the Gemara's time. Whole wheat was pas hadra, was considered low grade. Today we pay more for it. White bread is when you take away all this. Correct.
So we're saying that Rav had whole wheat bread, whole wheat matzah for Pesach.
Rabba. That's right. It's called Razaver. He had Razaver matzahs. That's it. For Rav Amar, Osir Lil Sois. Rav holds it's Osir to do. So he's Machmer. Tanya ein loishes in Sa'arim bePesach. How could Rav say it's Osir by Chitin? The Brisa seems to indicate it's only Osir by barley. Sa'arim Hudaloya Chiti Shari. Zaktimara, he learned the Talimi Boy Kamar. He learns the Brisa that Talimi Boy Chitin, the Kivin is Tziraya. Ailubumaya. Chitin, forget, instead of saying chitin are harder and they're less likely to become chometz from lasisa, he learns fakert. Chitin is more likely to become chometz from lasisa because it has a groove in it, and that groove will allow water to gather and become chometz. So it's where we up to. Aval Siri, the she, but barley, which is smoother. A Mashaper Dama, you might think you'd be allowed to make Lasisa, Kamash Mlon, you're not allowed to. Hadama Rava, Mutter Lil Size. Then Rava turned around and said the opposite, that you're actually allowed to make Lasisa. Titania, Yoitzin Bepasnakia, you could be Yoitza with white flour, Vadra, and Razaver, and whole wheat flour. The E Efsher Nikia below Lasisa. And it's impossible to create soyless naki, beautiful white flour, unless you soak the grain before you ground it. So you see clearly that Lasisa is allowed because the Brisa says beferish that you Yoitza the mitzvah of matzah the pasnakia. So now the Gemara is going to challenge this Yosy. Rava said you cannot have nice white flour unless you make Lasisa. Frank the Gemara, I'll prove to you otherwise. Say Rav Papa Rava. Rav Papa asked Akasha to Rava. Hakamachim, the kemachs, vaseltois. Seltois is soyless nikia. It's perfectly white soyless. Shal nachrim of goyim, shal kfarim. If they come from the villages, they're going to be tar. Why, if they come from the villages, they'll be tar? Because our question really is, were they huchsher l'kabel tuma? Were they soaked in water? If they were soaked in water, they're huchsher l'kabel tuma. If they were not soaked in water, they're not huchsher l'kabel tuma. So shal kfarim tarim, because we assume they were not soaked in water. Shal krachim from the big city to Mayan, the ones from the big city are tummy because we assume they are soaked in water. My timer, lav mishum deloy lasasi. It must be that the reason why the soilers coming from the villages are tar is because they don't soak them in water, and therefore they were never hoshul kabel tumba. Nevertheless, the kakari le soilers. You see, he said the chamchem ve'asalto shall nachim shall kvarim tarim. So they're called soilers and they're tar, meaning you didn't make lasisa. So you see clearly you could have white, nice flour even without lasisa. So Gemara Terguma Kimcha. Say that when it says of kfarim tarim, it's only referring to the kemach of the kfarim and not the soilus of the kfarim. Zok Rashi shal kfarim tarim lefisha ein makpidin al solta and la sois nakia. The farmers in the rural areas are not so makpid on having perfectly white kolkach, perfectly white flour. And therefore they don't soak them. But they were not hushul kabuduma. The kakar l'soilus, and the Brisa refers to them as soilus. So the Gemara answers, no, it's not going on soilus, it's going on the kemach. Basar denafik, after it left, I guess after Papa left Rava's house, Amar, he said, my timer, Rav Papa, you could have asked a much better kasha on Rava. You could have had a murder kasha on Rava. So Amar Abzeir, Amar Abirmiyah. Abzeir said, in the name of Abirmiyah, Amar Shmuel, Chitin shal menachos, the chitin of the carbon menachos, ein loises a nisan. You're not allowed to make lasisa. The kakari lahu silas. By the chitin, by menachos, we know the Torah says it has to be silas naki. Yet Shmuel said that you don't make lasisa. So you have a perfect raya that you don't have to make lasisa in order to have perfectly clean and nice white flour. Hadar Amar Rava mitzvah lil sois. So Rava was going back and forth. First he said asher lil sois, then he said mutter lil sois, and now Rava is saying mitzvah lil sois. Not only you're allowed to make lasisa, it's a mitzvah to make lasisa and to put the flour, the grain, into danger of becoming chametz. Why is that? The Torah tells you that you have to watch the matzos. Watch them from what? What can go wrong? Eloi the boy lasisa. If they didn't need lasisa, if they weren't in a place where they can even possibly become chametz, shimer lamai. Exactly what are you watching it for? Zakta Gemara. Ishimer delisha. If you're going to say that no, when does the shmira start? Not when you're making the flour, and lasisa is not an issue. Rather, you're starting to watch the flour when you mix it with water to make the dough. That's when it's in the danger zone. That's the shmira that the pasuk is referring to when the pasuk says "Shmartem es hamatzos." Zakta Gemara, Shimur delisha lav shimerhu. The shmira of lisha is not going to be mekayim the mitzvah of shmira unless the shmira occurs much earlier in the process. How do you know that? How do you know that it can't be called shmura matzah if you're just careful once you mix the flour with water at the later stage? If you have dough of nachem that you know aren't chametz, Rashi says you know because you check the simonim, you see it's not cracked, it's not discolored. Other Rishonim learn it's because people watched what the goyim were doing and they knew that this dough wasn't chametz. The halach is adam and malek kreishamehen. A person is allowed to eat as much as he wants of this on Pesach, but you're not makayim the mitzvah chilas matzah. The mitzvah chilas matzah we eat ala soiva. So as long as Allah soiva, the last matzah you eat, the matzah that you eat will be matzah that was properly shmura, that was not made from dough that was purchased from a guy. So clearly you see that even though you got this dough of a guy and you baked it, so you were in charge there, it's still not considered shmur matzah. My timer, mishum delay abed lushimur. It's not a good shmira. When you bake it, that's when you could be careful that it shouldn't become chometz. So with that, you should be yoytze the pasuk of ushmartem esamatzos. Elalav shmamina. You see here clearly that shmira is not good enough to satisfy the requirement of the Torah of ushmartem esamatzos. Elalav shmamina shimur meikara beinam. You need shimur meikara, meaning from way before, even when it's still grain, before you make it into flour, which means you have to be able to have a shmira by lasisa. And if there was no lasisa, you just ground it without lasisa, then shmira is not relevant. So therefore, Rava must be that you need to make lasisa, and that's the shmira that the Torah is referring to when it says ushmartem esamatzos. In fact, the Gemara, who said, "Umimai dilma shiny hasam the beidnu denachas lashimur la'aved lashimur." Maybe the reason why by the goyim it's not called shmura is because when is the danger zone? Maybe the danger zone is only once you mix the flour with the water when you're starting to make the dough. And that happened in the possession of the goy. Aval hacha, but here, the be'idin de nachas l'shimur, avad l'shimur, hakanami de shimur de lisha v'shimur. Who said that ushmartem esamatzos must be from before it's flour? And because of that, you prove that there must be l'sisa, so there's something to watch. Maybe all the Torah is makbid on is when you mix the flour with the water, that's when your chiyuv of shmira kicks in. And that's the biggest danger zone, when you're actually mixing the flour with the water. So therefore, Rava could not bring a raya. Rava could not bring a raya that the shmira has to be from before it becomes flour, from when it's already grain. But vafilu hachi, even though Rava couldn't bring that raya, loy hadrabe, he still held that the shmira has to come from before it becomes flour, when it's still grain. And then we have Shamar Mishas Ksira. The Omer Lahula Hani the Mahabche Kipi. He told the people that with their pitchforks they turn over and they bundle the stalks of wheat. Kimakprisu hafichu l'shum mitzvah. Have in mind when you're even dealing with the stalks of grain that it's l'shem matzas mitzvah. Alma kasaver shimur meikara mitchilasoi vatsoifoi be'inam. Now there's a machlokes in the early Achronim whether or not this shmira means merely being careful that it shouldn't become chametzdik, or the Vilna Gaon holds it's a special shmira l'shem matzos mitzvah. So you're not merely watching that it shouldn't become chametzik. You actually have to have a special kavanah l'shem matzos mitzvah. And one of the biggest nafkaminas would be machine matzah. Can you have shmura by machine matzah? So the pashut approach is, if it just has to be careful that it shouldn't become chametz, by machine matzah can be beautiful shmura. But if you hold you have to have a special kavanah, l'shem matzos mitzvah, a machine can't do that. But there are those who hold that even according to the Gra, a machine can do that, because the person who pushes the button to activate the machine, the operator, he can do that l'shem matzos mitzvah. But the machlokes is if it has to be l'shem matzos mitzvah, and there's also a shayla in the Rishonim. I believe the Gra holds all Pesach long. There's a hakpada to eat davka shmur matzah that was watched l'shem matzos mitzvah, and other Rishonim learn it's only for the seder, and the rest of the week there's no problem. I think some Sofer paskin that you should use hand shmura matzah for the sedarim, where you have the proper l'shem matzos mitzvah, and the rest of the week you don't need to have shmura with a kavanah of shmura. As long as you're sure that it didn't become chametzik, you can use it, and therefore machine matzah will be allowed. Mar bared Ravina, Mar the son of Ravina, malaktela ime ba'arbi. His mother used to take all the wheat as soon as they cut it, and she placed them for him in a special container that they should remain safe and not come into contact with water before Pesach. So it's funny, talk about Marvarid Ravina. but it doesn't say a story about Ravina. It says a story about Mrs. Ravina. Zok Gemara, who Arba Dechiti? This was a terrible tragedy. There was a ship of wheat that was being imported from somewhere, the Tova Bechishta, and the ship sunk in the river Chishta. So now you have a lot of wheat that got saturated with water. Now, of course, they sent in the recovery teams, and they were able to recover all of the wheat, but the wheat had water damage. So the halach is Shari Rava L'Zvuni L'Nochem. Rava allowed the salvage company that was Jewish. He allowed the Jew, the owner of the chitin, to sell all of it right before Pesach to a goy, even though the goy will have this grain throughout Pesach. And there might be a concern that the goy will sell it to a yid, and other yidden would have seen that this goy bought it from a yid, so they might assume that it's not chametz. So Esvei Rabba Bar Livoy LaRava. The beged shaved by Klaim. You have a beged that there's a thread of Klaim in it, and it's not noticeable, you can't tell. So the halach is Hareze Lo Yim Keren El Nachri. You're not allowed to sell that to a goy because the goy might turn it around and sell to a yid. You shouldn't make with it a saddle blanket for a chamor. But you are allowed to make them into techrichin lameis. And Rashi tells us because a mace is allowed to have shatnez. A mace is chavshi min mitzvahs, and we know that anything that it was used for a mace is asher bana, so nobody's going to use it afterwards. So tomorrow lo nochri my time aloi. What is the reasoning why you're not allowed to sell these things to a guy? Lav mishum dehader mazman li Yisrael. Are we not afraid that he's going to turn around and sell it to a yid, and the yid will assume that since it's originating from a yid, it's kosher to Pesach? So therefore, Hadu Amar Rava, then Rava thought it over and he said, maybe don't sell it to a guy. Lizvinu kava kava li Yisrael. Sell it in little quantities to yidden, where we're sure that where we're sure that they'll eat it up before Pesach, and therefore we don't have this problem. Tanarabban, ein moilin is hakder bePesach. You're not allowed to be moilel akadera lePesach. And Rashi says it means bekemach kari melila kishenoisen kemach l'tafshel. So you pour some wheat into a tafshel, I guess, in order to thicken it up. But Rashi says if you do want to do this, then noisen is a kemach, the achach noisen is a chaymitz. Put in kemach first, then they dump vinegar on it, so the vinegar, the raw vinegar that hits the kemach in the topshul will instantly stop the chimutz process, like we learned on Amud Aleph from Yosy. But the yesh oimrim, af noisen is a chaymitz, v'achach noisen is a kemach. You can put the chaymitz in first, even though the chaymitz will get absorbed and diluted into the topshul and will lose some of its strength, it will still have the koyach to stop the chimutz process in its tracks. Man yesham, who is the yesham? Maybe it's going according to Rabbi Yehuda that nan ha'ilfis v'akdeira she'avir miraischen. If you took a pot off the fire, so it's a kli rishon, lo yiten l'soichan tavlin. You're not allowed to put spices on Shabbos into a kli rishon because it's going to cook. If you put something into a kli rishon, it's going to cook the tavlin. Aval noisen l'soicha kaira. But if you pour the water over into a klisheni, then you're allowed to put tavlin in. So if you put the water into a klisheni, you're allowed to put in the instant coffee. Or the sechatamchi. Rabbi Yehuda holds that you're allowed to put the tavlin into anything. Rashi says into a klisheni, of course. You're allowed to put into a klisheni, but if there's chaymitz or tzir in the klisheni, then it's still osir because the chaymitz makes it strong. Rashi says, even though the chaymitz and tzir was in the tavshel before and it would have gotten diluted, you're still not allowed to pour anything into because it'll cook. So oibazoi, our Gemara is saying, the same way it'll cook in Hilchos Bishul of Shabbos, so too it retains its potency, even though it's absorbed in the topshul, and its qualities will stop anything from becoming chametz, and therefore you're allowed to pour flour into a topshul that has chametz in it. Of course, halakha l'maisa, we wouldn't dare do this nowadays. The nukma Rabbi Yosy. So why don't we say that it's going according to Rabbi Yosy, who we had on Amud Aleph? Because we said Rabbi Yosy Omer Shayrin b'chaymitz v'chaymitz tzimtzon. Rabbi Yosy said yesterday, if you have these kernels that are starting to swell and we're afraid they're going to split and become chametzik, quickly put them into vinegar, and the vinegar will stop the fermentation process. So Rabbi Yosy there was saying if you put it into pure vinegar, that's where he says it has that potency to stop the fermentation process. But here you're talking about putting the chametz into a tavshil. Maybe he would be moide over there loy that it loses its potency. Ula Amar echadze vechadze aser. Regardless, you should never ever put any type of flour into any type of tavshil, even if you have all your ideas. We tell the nazir, stay far away from any chance that you might come to drink wine. Schar schar, go around. Lekarma loy sikra. Don't get anywhere near the danger zone. So therefore, we don't play with fire. If we don't mix flour into any type of liquids at all on Pesach. Rapabi Sharile, Luberdiki de Veresh Kalusa, Lemimcha Kedere Bechasisi. The Berdika were the cooks that worked in the kitchen of the Reish Kalusa. They worked in the White House. The cooks that worked in the White House, Rav Papi allowed them to play with fire and to thicken up the tavshil on Pesach with flour. So Chasisi Rashi says, as Kim Chadav Shoina, again, it's flour that was made out of wheat kernels that was already baked. So there's less of a chance they'll become chametz, but there's still someone playing with fire. So Amarava, Ika de Shari Kahai Milsa, the Duchte de Shchiche Avdi. I understand if the Reish Kalusa himself was doing it with the utmost caution, there it might be allowed. But you're going to allow staff in the kitchen who are not Kayanim's reason name to play with fire? I can't imagine. Ika Dami, there was another shot that was the opposite. Rav Aguva Machala Kudu Chazisi. Rav himself did it because he held that there's no problem with it. Zok to Gemara weiter. Ein noisten kemach l'soich cheroises or l'soich achardel. You're not allowed to put flour into cheroises. Now this cheroises is not our cheroises that we dip our mortar into. Rashi says it was some type of condiment that had vinegar in it and flour in it, and the flour, when you put it into the vinegar, became somewhat chametzik, and that created an acidic type of flavor, and that was the flavor that they were after. So you can't put kemach into charoises or l'seichachardel or into mustard. And if you did do that, yochel miyad, eat it right away because it will become chametz imminently. So if you eat it quickly, you'll eat it before it becomes chametz. Reb Meir Oyser, you can't eat it at all. Ein mevashlan is a Pesach. We know the korban Pesach, and the Gemara is going to place us as struggles why this halach is here. It's not relevant to the subject matter. But you're not supposed to cook the korban Pesach, loy b'mashkin, not with any type of drink, v'loy b'mei peris, and not in mei peris. Because it says b'moyim, so you're not allowed to cook the korban Pesach and then you may perish. Forget, even though it says uvashal mavushal b'mayim, which would indicate that it's only water that it's also to cook the korban Pesach in. The Mishnah is telling us a chiddush you cannot cook it in anything, and the Gemara is going to tell us why. Avol sachin, you're allowed to after you roast it, or Rashi b'shas while it's roasting, you're allowed to baste it. You're allowed to smear it with any type of meperis, and after it's fully roasted, you're allowed to dip it into ketchup. What Bill Noy say by you're allowed to dip it into any condiment. A baker has water that he uses to rinse his utensils, to rinse his hands. So there's going to be some residue of dough in it. Usually you spill them out because they will become chametz. This machlokes in the Mishnah, if you should eat it right away or not, is only by the mustard, where there's less of a chance that it will become chametz. But if you put the flour into the charoises, that's going to become chametz right away. And Reb Meir would not argue, and the Chum would not say yoichel miyad, divrei akol yisaref miyad. Everybody would agree you must burn it right away. It's aser. The Tanya Namihachi, ein noisten kemach l'soicha charoises, v'im nosan yisaref miyad. So you see that charoises, there's no machlokes on. Everybody holds you have to burn it. It's chametz. But l'soicha chardel, but if you put it into mustard, there Reb Meir omer yisaref miyad. There Reb Meir says it's chametz right away. The Chachamim omer yoichel miyad. And the Chachamim over there says that you're allowed to eat it before it becomes chametz. Amar Vunda Beit Yehuda, Amar Rab Nachman, Amar Shmuel, halacha kedivrei Chachamim. The halacha is like the Chachamim that by chardel you're allowed to eat it. Amar Rab Nachman, Yitzchak Vunda Beit Yehuda. Acharoises Kamar, when we pass like the Chachamim that you're allowed to eat it, is it even on charoises, which Reb Kana just said is not true? Acharoises kamar or a chardal kamar, or is it only on chardal? Amar lei lemay nafkamina. What's the nafkamina? Lichad Rav Kahana. It'll be told in Rav Kahana. Amar Rav Kahana machloikas l'secha chardal. Avol l'secha acharoises devrakol yisarf miyad. Rav Kahana learned that the machloikas, the only mogam to be matir, is only in chardal but not in charoises. Amar lei, so he answered back, loy shamili. I didn't hear. Meaning, claiming severely, I didn't hold the Rav Kahana. Nayel the chachamim allow you to eat it even if you put the kemach into the charoises. Omar Rabashi Kavazad Rav Kahana Mistavra. It makes sense to say, like Rav Kahana, that everybody agrees that in charoises it becomes chametz right away, and you're not allowed to eat it. You have to burn it. With Omar Shmuel, Ein Halacha Krab Yosy. Shmuel said on Mem Amar Aleph that vinegar. Rabbi Yosy says if you put the bloated kernels into vinegar, it stops the fermentation process. And Shmuel argues with him. So let's say that Shmuel holds that vinegar doesn't do so much. Charoises has vinegar in it. So my love, Zok Gemara, so Musa like Thomas, or the Bach changed the gear, so Mida like Thomas. Since the vinegar does not have an effect that it stops it from chametz, so maybe hachamur mechama. So maybe I would argue that since it doesn't have an effect to stop fermentation, maybe it actually promotes fermentation, and therefore it should be usher, and we should pass like a kahana. So you don't have a raya from that. Maybe it doesn't have such a strong quality that it'll stop something that's already starting to become chametz from becoming chametz. But who said it's like water? Maybe it will not make something chametz either, and therefore maybe you can paskin even if you put flour into charoises. Maybe you can paskin there as well that you're allowed to eat it right away. Okay, let's stop here. It's like this is very. We're learning very technical Gemaras now.